time, I'm happy that Trump has reminded you guys that actually you are not what you are. So
Everybody, great to be with you again on the Bad Natives. And for our introductions, we start with Bob Kabushenga. Bob, where do you find yourself?
this is Robert Kaushenga, the bad native who is not in Kampala. I am in a very cold Amsterdam this morning. And well, for a very private and family reason, that's why I'm here. But I'm also taking time off to vend my coffee. So it's great to have you guys.
I am Charles Onyanga Obo in Nairobi, the green city in the sun. I know we're in the sun. I'm not sure how green we still are, but
You're full of concrete now.
And good morning, everybody. I'm Ferial Hafaji in Johannesburg, where it's very green, but we're having an unseasonal La Nina spring. And so it often feels like winter here. Very strange, this climate change thing. So
That's
today,
true. That's true. We haven't had the consistent rains that we normally have in Uganda in November, and we're now worried about the arrival of grasshoppers. So there's going to be a crisis if grasshoppers don't come this season. We might have Gen Z protests on that issue.
and speaking of Gen Z protests, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about whether we can yoke them, whether there are common threads, how they sustain themselves. And I was also looking, Robert, at Morocco, where there were
Mhm,
the 212 protests, also being called Gen Z
mhm,
protests. Very
mhm,
different outcome to what you saw in Tanzania. Have you
mhm.
been following them, and what are you thinking?
I think the protests in Morocco present a very interesting paradox. And once again, Morocco continues to be an outlier in terms of their development agenda, their ambitions, also an outlier in football. And I am not surprised that they are an outlier in this one. And let me explain. So, first of all, for the guys who are listening to us and may not realize that there were youth protests in Morocco, let's just remind them of what happened. I think what happened was there were some people who died. I think some women died in a public hospital, and so some young guys using technology, especially based off of something called disruption or distortion, some app called something like that, and TikTok started mobilizing protests and they were basically anti-corruption protests. So the interesting thing about those protests is this, that there is widespread unemployment. It's 12.8% generally, 35% for the youth, uh, just in particular. So clearly, for the youths in Morocco, it's a very specific question. They're saying they demanded that the king fires the prime minister, and so that we can deal, or so they can deal with the issues of anti-corruption, because I think it's rife all over the place. But here is the two interesting things. We always assume that because there is investment in public works, it will generate national pride and employment for people. So it turns out that one of the reasons for the protests is that a lot of money is being spent on the facilities for the World Cup in 2030. So the stadia, infrastructure, all of that. Now, that is obviously not translating into employment for the young people. And I can understand why, because they must have gotten foreign contractors, and a lot of the jobs are definitely going to those types of people. So that's the first thing that's very interesting, is that we make the assumption that because there is expenditure in these facilities and we display them as national progress, that there is benefit for the people. And the young Moroccans are saying no. The second most interesting thing where Morocco is now an outlier is the way the king responded. He was very clever not to address the protesters directly. He was very clever about that because he didn't obviously want to give their protest legitimacy. But he addressed the parliament and urged them to accelerate the social reforms that had been tabled in July. So basically, instead of going to the streets and beating up the youths and blaming them for being unreasonable and being agents of foreign interference, he took responsibility for their issues, took the agenda, and took it to the public officials who are supposed to be delivering it. So clearly, you can see that the leadership of the country is focused on the bigger problem. And I think the long answer to your question is there is a running theme. All the youth are simply saying the countries are not working for us, the economies are not working for us, we don't have opportunity, we need our countries to create opportunity. So clearly, over time, the, the drivers of these protests are becoming the same reasons that these countries are not working for young people. Yeah.
Hmm. And Charles, I was interested that the catalyst for the protest wasn't a big trend issue like we want jobs or we don't have food. So big issues, obviously, but it was actually the deaths, I think, of six pregnant women whilst giving birth in a hospital. So a very specific driver of that protest in Morocco.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, apart from the health and the World Cup issue, there was also the question of education. Now, like Bob was saying, not only did the king, push the government to commit to dialogue, but they also specific, there are two other things which they did. One, they agreed to increase the health and education budget by 23%, which were the very, very
That's
specific.
huge, eh?
Yeah,
That's
it's
such a
huge.
victory. Mm.
Yeah, as you said, were the specific demand the young people were making. But they also announced the creation of 27,000 public jobs, so, and a lot of them will go to young people. But the one that intrigues me the most is that they then approved, not just talked about, they approved uh, two political reforms. One, to to increase the representation of women in parliament, and two, to increase the number of youth in parliament and lower the barriers to entry, which was something. And Farrell and Bob, if you think of it, it's of all places, because Morocco and Eswatini are really the last two places in Africa which are where the king is the ultimate authority. So, you'd have expected that these initiatives would have come from the democracy, not from a monarchy. But
Exactly.
yeah, but they came from the monarchy, and the question has been why? Why is this the case? And it is very interesting, precisely because the monarch is unelected. His legitimacy doesn't come from elections. Hmm? It comes from being this father of the nation, this unifying thing. So the protest didn't pose a political threat to him. So he has the luxury of responding this way. But democratic governments see protests as potentially leading to their downfall. So they tend to be brutal, which is really
That's
very messed
really
up.
that's really that's really interesting. And so I do want to move to
But
Tanzania
but
as the
Furio,
large. Yes,
Furio,
yes,
Furio,
Robin.
before you move
Mm, mm.
before you move to Tanzania, I think there is another lesson that Morocco offers us. The monarchy in Morocco has been consistently progressive from King uh, Hassan to King Mohammed. They've been consistently progressive in their social approach. In fact, at one point, this the current king, his late father, applied to be part of the European Union. So, but even in the protests, the Arab Spring protests of 2011, I think this current king was already in office. They moved ahead of all the North African countries and took the wind out of that protest and were able to quickly implement reforms and generate prosperity. Let's not forget, guys, Morocco gets 12 million tourists a year. That economy alone has been accelerated to try and create opportunity. So I think that's the other lesson. The Moroccan leadership, particularly the monarchy, has tended to be ahead of the curve in terms of their response to crisis. Because I think, as
That's
Charles said,
really fascinating.
their legitimacy derives from the people, and they understand that, and that their continued engagement with the population is where they draw their legitimacy. So that's important.
That is absolutely fascinating. And on the tourism side, I was reading some reports out of Arusha, which looked at how tourism to Tanzania was basically cut off at the knees. Obviously, it's not the most important story of now, but that was also a key export earner for Tanzania and for Zanzibar, which was really, although it didn't have protests, it was severely harmed by the outcome of the election. And I can imagine that cancellations have been huge. Have you been reading at all on the aftermath? All what I wanted to draw our attention to was that Gado cartoon on the aftermath of the protests, which was really, sometimes cartoonists just hold the nation's experience in their fingertips, and he really captured what has happened there. He had Samia as the distant monarchical figure, um, oppressing her people. It was quite something to see. Either of you see that? Obviously you did. Hmm?
Gado is Charles's friend. So let Charles defend him.
Yeah, I would love to hear Charles take her.
But you shouldn't escape. We will come back to you. Must tell us how the situation is in Sadak. But you see, one of the things, and I think you see that in the Garo cartoon, is when they lifted the blockade on the internet, just these incredible images started to come, and it is really, we haven't seen you know uh, some of them almost reminded you of some of the scenes we saw in Rwanda during the 1994 genocide.
They really
You know,
did.
because there are now people who are hazarding that anything up to 3,000 people could have been killed. And I personally think that is a little bit on the higher side, but I think it indicates that easily over 1,000 people were killed. And they, we look at the pictures of her being sworn in inside, basically a military facility, and with no people in it. And if you just think how far, uh, President Samia has moved from the old tradition of the pageantry, it is shocking. So obviously in terms of the legitimacy issues that she has to deal with, they are huge. They are huge. And I don't know how she gets away from under this. But this, and you mentioned tourism, it will take years of hard work for for uh, for that economy and for that country to restore the credibility it has lost in those 2 to 3 days.
Unbelievable. Welcome, Adesua. Until we see you, Bob, what are you thinking about what happens in Tanzania now? You're on
I,
mute.
I, yeah, I always default to history and to events, particularly the interesting events of South Africa, and as instructive. There will always be those moments we look back to, and we say this is the point at which the history of a country turned. So in Uganda, for instance, the history of our country was defined in 1966 and what happened uh, between the then prime minister and the president, fighting that took place and the violent overthrow. So, but I want to use two very interesting examples from Southern Africa. One is the Sharpeville massacre that everybody knows about. The second one is the shooting of the kids in Soweto in 1976, the famous photograph of Hector Peterson. Now, they clearly what has happened in Tanzania is that whoever made the decision to close the internet was really short-sighted because they assumed that they were operating under the cover of darkness. But what they didn't count on is that at some point they would have to restore the internet, and the horror of what happened would still reach the world. So now the horror of what happened has reached the world. And in Tanzania, I look back at two historical incidents. There's what has always been referred to as the Zanzibar Revolution. Uh, and then, of course, the mutiny of the army in mainland Tanganyika, which then led to the Ujamaa and the political reforms that Nyerere tried. I would like to say that this election, the conduct of Samia in this election, has redefined the political direction of Tanzania in ways that are irreversible. But it has also, in a way, redefined the way East Africa goes. Here's why: because the dissonance in terms of the voices that have come out, you've got President Ruto of Kenya making an interesting statement about the democratic nature of the margin. You've got our own president in Uganda blaming foreign interference squarely. So I think that the region itself will be affected by what has happened, and that there's going to be a crisis of legitimacy for the East African political leadership. And very interestingly, one person who is very quiet is President Kagame in Rwanda. He's got said absolutely nothing, which is classic him. So I think that the images flowing out of Tanzania are going to be very disturbing, and nobody is going to be able to argue for those actions that were taken against those people. And I think that I don't see how they can PR their way out of this. I think it's going to take a lot of political work, and I think the damage is immense. Yeah.
I was reading that they are going for this idea of a third force present in the country that had fomented the protests. This is a very common go-to for leaders who are caught in crises like this. Charles, to what extent do you give credibility to that an East African third force was somehow responsible? President Museveni saying that there were Western interests. That usually means rights-based NGOs, which all our leaders point fingers at when they find themselves in trouble. What do you think?
It's well, I think that we saw on social media there was a lot of reporting about possibly Ugandan troops intervening, and they say their Swahili is different, or they don't speak Swahili at all. There were all sorts of photographs which were claiming that to show Ugandan troops. My own sense that it would be very surprising. I would be very surprised if the Tanzanians let in Ugandan troops. For one, it would actually be political suicide for Samia. Eh? They are a very, very, very proud country with a very proud tradition, and just the idea that Ugandan troops would intervene to save them, which, as Bob said, they kind of despise the Ugandan tradition. That would be very, very surprising. But there is a part of it where, and we have even seen that in Kenya. Some of the countries, when they are faced with their own brutality and all that, the only way they understand it is to argue that that was not us. the
Yeah.
that level of brutality and murderousness can only be done
Yeah.
by a foreigner. So I think it is an escape. But Pharaoh, you speak to us. I mean, Tanzania is a SADC country. It is probably the most violent election that SADC has seen.
Mm.
Even in fact, the aftermath has even been more violent than the ones in Mozambique. What are the conversations in the region?
So I think that President Ramaphosa has been made interim chairperson because of Madagascar,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
so I think he's going to kick it into touch, until, or try to kick it into touch until after the G20 meeting, because there's a lot of shuttle diplomacy happening right now. Our ministers, president, deputy president, going across the region and across the continent more widely to try and build this as Africa's G20, which brings us to the next question: is is it going to be a damp squib? Because you'd have seen that we managed to get into the crosshairs of Donald Trump for the I counted for the 15th time last week. It is my Trump tracker. 15th time where he just announced on Truth Social that no official would be allowed to come to the G20 meeting, throwing things into complete disarray because JD Vance's advanced team were in the country at the time. They were doing the security checks, doing the venue checks, doing the hotel checks. It was all set. He was going to be here with Usha and his young family. They were going to probably do a safari thereafter. And one post from Donald Trump, you can't get a word out of the embassy on what's going to happen here. That post was also really interesting because he had confused South America and South Africa in a speech, and then he needed to back up that he did mean South Africa, and then just banned everybody when in fact US officials have been part of most of the meeting. So this is on the scale of diplomacy, it's way off the charts. And now, of course, Javier Milei of and Argentina has pulled out, and so we really need to show a face of African unity. And therefore, I think the Tanzanian matter is going to be kicked into touch until after the G20 ends on the 23rd of November. But I'd love to know how this is looking, where you sitting.
Bob.
I I think Furio, when you talk to the senior officials, especially in the Foreign Office in South Africa, please tell them to come back to the continent. And this is a very powerful lesson to them. They've tended to behave because they were members of G20 and BRICS. They've tended to behave that they're on the other side, and then they've treated the rest of us as if we are the same way the Europeans and the Americans treat us in terms of how they relate to us. There's just a bit of politeness from the political establishment and occasional remembrance of the history, but you can see that they've tended to behave like they're on the other side. Now, for the second time, I'm happy that Trump has reminded you guys that actually you are not what you are. So, the question for you is,
We're
how
not
do the
what we
officials?
think we are, or we're not what we are.
No, you are not. No, you're African. So, and this, if there has
Do,
ever
do you
been a
think
time,
do you think we don't know that?
no, you don't. I think you've completely forgotten, and that's why you are busy pleading to be accepted back into that club, and you're worried about. If if I was a typical, this is the moment. I never thought I would ever say this. This is when you miss a guy like Robert Mugabe. You see, Mugabe would have made the most of this
It's
moment, but
you take your Britain and I keep my
okay,
Zimbabwe like that.
thank you very much. But but my point I'm trying to make is that South Africa can flip this. One, they don't have to play into Trump's politics because I think I don't know this for a fact. I'm honestly, genuinely speculating. I suspect it was a knee-jerk reaction to the election in New York, and it looks
Sure.
to me like both Musk and Trump are back together. That's what it looked like, or at least they're batting from the same side, and so it just is unexplainable. But that is my speculation. So, but what South Africa has an opportunity to do is to use the G20 as a platform for taking leadership. In fact, if I were them, I don't know if it's too late. I would definitely invite some big African presidents or big African, high level African leaders to be in attendance as part of the opening ceremonies and put forward an African face. I
They're
would
all
get
coming,
some,
eh? I hope they're all coming, but they've been invited. Yeah?
yeah, but you see, I would make sure this is where I would invest diplomatic muscle in getting high level attendance from the different countries. I would bring in the African business guys. I mean, for whatever this guy is worth, for instance, the guy of Guinea, he has shown that he has some rare earth things that these guys need. You bring a guy like that and you make sure that he's in your corner, because the more of these leaders can gang together, that's the only language that these other guys will listen to. And so South Africa needs to stop
Hmm.
its lone wolf approach to the world. It needs to provide leadership to the continent. And this is one platform, the G20, where it can say, look, guys, this is what we should do together. And use that platform to talk up things like AFCTA, talk up things like, you know, uh, so the International Trade Center has just opened an office in Nairobi. How does that, to promote African trade? Those are the things to show the world that Africa can have its own options. I think worrying about whether the other foreigners from other parts of the world come or not is not a big issue anymore. I mean, we should actually just send them a message. We called you, you didn't come, it's fine. The party goes on.
Yeah, I guess that's because of narrative. I push back against this narrative in South Africa as hard as you can, that it doesn't, if he was never going to come, this is always going to end this way. But there's almost an obsession that America is still the superpower in the world and that you have to be on its good side. That's not a narrative that I see in the rest of our continent, Charles. What do you think?
No, of course, you have to put this in the broader context. Personally, I think that what South Africa is trying to do is because there has been a shift. There have been a shift, and the it's there is the US decline. You can see it in the number, in the percentage of reserves that countries have in dollars. Not too long ago, it was 78%. Now it is coming to 50%. So that space is opening even within the G20 context itself. So I just think that there is just depending on how South Africa plays it, there is an opportunity there for it to to win some important space. But my own sense had always been that not only would Trump come, but he wouldn't allow JD Vance. And you have to go
Did you
back.
think he wouldn't let him come, even though his team was here and
Yeah,
everything was being done?
because in earlier this year, JD Vance spoke at the Munich Conference on Security.
Yeah.
I totally disagree with his views, but I was impressed by the argument he made against globalization and its failure. It was really, I mean, it was a master, and it's one of those things that I've stored in in a folder, and I keep listening to it. And what happened is that the guy was so good that Trump, doesn't praise other people. He's averse. He must be the center. He praised J.D. Vance. Now, if J.D. Vance had come, he was going to make a standout speech, irrespective of whether you are a centrist or leftist who disagrees with him. He was going to shine. And at a time when Trump is beginning to lose his magic, they have just lost. They were,
That's really interesting.
yeah, they were hammered in the midterm elections and all those kind of things. He is being booed. He's favorable, his popularity is in the negatives. I think that he was not going to allow JD Vance, who is being pushed by the people who see Trump going back, all the signs of his senility and all those things, and they're kind of saying, JD Vance, you should take out your fine suit and prepare. So I was always it was always doubtful
Hmm.
that he would show, but
So he
I
didn't
think,
want him to shine.
yeah, he didn't want him to shine, but I've seen Naledi, your foreign minister, has been traveling around Africa, I think trying to
Mm.
canvas around the G20 issues. I think that's probably the right thing to do. There has been a lot of, I was looking at some data. I think the South African economy is in its best health for a very, very long time. So I see Cyril Ramaphosa has some wind in his tails. So I think that if depending on how he positions, he can actually milk it to to some good effect. But he should they should, as to speak to the issues Bob just raised. They they should pivot. They should begin to take this organization away from the extreme western corner in which it was, and bring it further to the south, where it's drifting, because they must respond to BRICS, and so there's an opportunity there for South Africa to do something around that.
That's
I
there's
just
there's going
wanted,
to be there's some
Furio.
interesting. Yes, please. Yes,
I,
please,
I
Robert.
wanted, I'm glad Charles raises the issue of JD Vance. There's a thought that crossed my mind that I had forgotten. In the same vein, JD Vance cancelled his trip to Kenya
Hmm.
because, yes, so it was billed as a high profile visit. The Kenyans were preparing, everyone was ready. And I just wanted to add to Charles's perception that you see, for every American president since Bill Clinton, a second term visit to Africa has always been like a crowning moment. Everybody comes. So the question
Hmm.
is, do you let JD Vance come to Africa and steal your thunder in the same way Charles was talking about? And especially if you're contemplating a third term. And what happens if there is a fallout and you can't get your third term, or you have to contest for your third term and the guy on the other side is JD Vance? You have exactly the same constituency to appeal to. You could split it. So I now get Charles's point that actually South Africa was or the G20 was an unwitting victim of very municipal politics in America, in the White House, and particularly the MAGA movement. That this has really very little to do,
Hmm.
and that's why he probably mixed up the countries. So yeah, Charles, I think
Yes,
that is more
perhaps.
that
And
explains it better.
it's interesting, the EU AU unity has been quite interesting to me to watch, with a series of meetings being held in the run up. Europe announcing quite a big deal with the entire continent on renewables and other trade deals, big. And then straight after the G20, they all go to a Luanda summit in Zambia, Luanda, where the full AU EU is meeting. Charles, do you find that interesting? I thought that it was a really important alliance to watch, especially with what's happening globally.
Yeah, in fact, there's one of these EU commissioners. I forget her name. She actually said, and after she said it, it was taken out of the news. I think they didn't want Trump to pick on it. She
Yes.
said that America walking away, particularly in places like Africa in the global south, was an opportunity for Europe to rise. Mm? Because Trump's exit makes the cost of European expansion of its influence fairly low, and we have also seen with what has happened in the Sahel and the French getting out of there, there is quite a significant pivot to the rest of Africa. So I think that we are beginning to see this new dynamic, where the EU tries to present a new face, a new form of engagement with Africa. I think they do recognize that the free trade things, I'm beginning to see interesting data about its impact. I think they want to be part of that, and around these security issues, I think that they want to be part of it, and we are seeing things like take for example Rwanda's president is in Mozambique. There is a We have seen very continuous support for it, and they there is even talk that now the Rwandese will establish a permanent base. They'll become the first African country to establish a permanent military base outside their country, and it seems that this view that they are providing stability, which allows gas, which would be very, very, very cheap gas for the EU to get out of Mozambique. So you're right that this is not it's not one of those dances around the fire, a ritual dance around the fire. It seems that there's some very substantial pieces of policy and geopolitics which are coming together around that EU AU nexus.
And also what's going to be interesting next week that I'm watching, and maybe you could help me here, is it doesn't look like she's going to be here. That in fact the premier of China will represent him. And when I've asked our colleagues, colleagues in government, what does that mean? They suggest is because there's succession planning happening in China, and more do you see the premier attending, and that Xi Jinping only goes to the big ones like the ASEAN summit or so. I'd love to hear your views on China, because obviously China is the biggest ally, presence, influence on our continent of what we still call the superpowers. Bob?
I think two things have happened. I think China has burnt its fingers in Africa and is redefining its relationship with the continent. So you see a cooling down of engagement on the African continent. You don't hear or read of big monies coming in to do infrastructure projects. You don't hear of those things anymore. In fact, what you hear more is them trying to recover whatever investments they made. So while they may make polite statements about engaging with Africa, they've actually exited. So the fact of sending a prime minister, but also you're right, there is a discussion which last year was not on the table, but this year has come into play. The Chinese political establishment is beginning to discuss the succession question. They're feeling that whatever they may think, she is not going to be there forever. And it may not even be in the long term interests of both the Communist Party of China and the Chinese country in the new geopolitics coming for them to rely on only one leader. So I think that has forced uh, the party to start a quiet conversation about the replacement of Xi. So he won't be the emperor that everyone was saying he would be about this time last year. So there is that element. And as such, China has gone insular. But, you know, talking about the EU earlier on and now, and China, I sense a redefinition of how both want to engage with Africa. Both, one of the things I get from the diplomats, the European diplomats in Kampala, is that all of them, most European diplomats in Africa are now scampering and falling over themselves over the trade issue. You see a notable movement away from democracy, human rights, politics. In fact, what's interesting is that the EU has been very quiet about Tanzania. So they are repositioning along business interests, they are repositioning along resources and along security. Security, why? Because security is one of the things that they're having to deal with is the question of migration. They really want to stop us guys from
Yeah.
trying to flee into their countries. So that's primary. Number two is an alternative source of fuel or energy that Charles talked to away from the Middle East and Europe, particularly Russia. So, as a result of that, the Europeans are honing in on a trade relationship, and it's coming from the EU, it's coming from Britain, and you can see that they see an opening to come in and do that. And so are the Chinese. Now, one of the things I also see a lot now, the Chinese pushing, particularly in Uganda, is they are not talking about coming to look for contracts to build roads, to build, no, no, no. They are
Yeah.
looking for trading relationships. How can we move commodities to China? What's very interesting is that they've now moved away from dealing with Ugandan middlemen or Ugandan traders. They've come and set up shops in our places. Some of them are even setting up manufacturing outfits to do knockoffs of American products. So, so I think that the approach to Africa from all of these powers is now changing. It's changing away from the human rights and democracy agenda and politics and struggle, because the Chinese were on the
To
politics and
trade.
revolution side. They're moving more into trade. What can they get? The only problem I feel, again, and which is why I was telling you that South Africa needs to provide leadership on G20, is that you don't see much preparation by the African establishments on the issue of trade. You don't see our best minds engaging with trade issues. You don't see any public debates and discussions about logistical capacity to do trade. So those are the things that we should be thinking about, but we're not. We are just
I see a lot of those discussions because the free trade area is it's my passion. I see a lot of discussions. What I see less of is action. So you're in the Netherlands, looking to make coffee exchanges. I'd love you to be doing that in South Africa. I'd love to see more of that Pan African trade happening. But as we push to close now,
I
I
want no.
wondered.
Wait, Fury. I'm actually going to tell you my
I'm waiting. I'm
experience.
waiting.
That's why I'm very
Yeah.
angry with you South Africans that you are so closed. When I tried to sell coffee to you guys in South Africa, I was told point blank that I can only bring in green beans. The
Hmm.
roasting and whatever is closed. So you just wonder whether these guys are serious about the statements that they make. You're Africans. No, you're not African. So, so
Fair
please,
comment.
But,
yeah,
Fair
Charles.
comment.
but the I think that the it's Bob, I disagree. It's not that the Chinese are withdrawing. In fact, if you look at some of the data, I mean, they're not doing the old thing of throwing money at African infrastructure without second thought. But there has been a pivot. We are seeing a shift to what you would call soft power. So if for example, if you look at the scholarships that African students that China is giving to African students, I mean, in the thousands. We are not just talking one, two. The numbers are actually
Mm,
near in the tens of thousands, and they continue to roll out their Confucius centers and and all that. A lot of cooperation around technology. We are seeing a lot of now conversions of loans African countries used to have into yuan. The Kenyans just did it. a couple of countries, and I think the big one, Ethiopia. So I think that they are kind of in a kind of a more a different phase as you look for because China always after a Mao figure you always have a Deng Xiaoping. So after a Xi Jinping, you are going to have an equivalent of a Deng Xiaoping. So we are going to have what it is in I think at the end of the Cold War they called glasnost. We might have it,
Glasnost, okay.
Perestroika.
and I think probably a leader who is more to the center than Xi Jinping has been, because he's really been a tough man.
Yes, quite the tough. Shall we move toward party shots and happy news in such a time, if we can?
Unfortunately, no. And
No.
for me, yes, because if we do that, we avoid a really, really two very bad stories that should remind us of where we are in our continent. The first
True.
one is just the sheer massacre of people in Darfur, in Fasher, when the RSF took over that place. Period. They just killed people. If you think Samir killed people, those guys killed people.
Yeah.
It was, and you ask yourself, do Africans' lives really, are they worth anything? But you see, for me, it's a very terrible reminder of the thuggery that is at the helm of African politics. What I find baffling is that there are African governments that are supporting RSF so that they can be in the good books or are facilitating the UAE's own support for RSF. And you wonder what the UAE stands to gain from this kind of behavior. So really the death in in Fasher, and the behavior of what has happened by the military establishments, both government and the militia of RSF, and the killings of people is really, really, honestly, if we're outraged about Samia, what happened in Fasher was much worse. And the final one for me is the story of Mali. You know, the guy took over the government in Mali promising to deal with the Islamist rebels. Now they've blocked all the roads leading to Bamako, and Bamako has no
Yeah.
support. So the government is only running Bamako. But what's very interesting is that the Islamists have refused to take over. They don't want the responsibility of running a country. They just want to control the territory they control and continue to be unaccountable. So what's happening in Mali is very symptomatic. We'll wake up one day because even analysts are saying these guys, this war could be exported further south before they actually take over the government. So countries like Ghana,
Mm.
countries the lower West African countries are actually under threat from a security standpoint. So it made me think whether Trump really understood what he was talking about when he talked about bombing people in Nigeria because they were killing Christians. Well, I think the situation in the Sahel is quite complex, and I don't know how we're going to solve those things.
Hmm. Thank you. Absolutely, you're right. We have to.
Yeah,
Those are huge.
yeah.
Charles, parting shot from you.
There is a very happy one from South Africa. I was reading about this entrepreneur called Gerard Olitsi.
Yes.
so, so this guy, he went into the rundown parts of Joburg, and he has been buying it and beautifying it, and the city is coming back, to life. It's a very, very interesting model, and I don't think I've ever had anything like that anywhere. So it's something that people who are looking for renewal of inner cities might like to consider. But
Mhm.
Bob just talked of Trump and the Nigerian Christians. There's been this Nigerian guy who has gone viral because after Trump said that he would intervene to stop the killing of Christians, the Nigerian Christians, many of them came out and said, yes, we are under siege. We want Trump to come. So this guy went on a run and said, it is really interesting that the Nigerians are, are asking Trump to save them and they are not asking Jesus Christ.
Fantastic.
Wha- what if what
He
if
said,
Trump what if Trump
he,
what if Trump is Jesus Christ?
yeah, he said
No, he thinks he is. He thinks he is.
he thought they would be rallying Jesus Christ, but they have put their money on Trump.
Firio, I have a quick one for you. What's this alliance
Yes, please.
between Mazibuko and Mazibuko trying to run for mayor and Rise Mutsanzi? What's going on about that? How did Mazibuko split from Helen
Oh,
Zealand? What
yes.
happened? What?
Um, okay, so some background. So Lindiwe Mazibuko is one of our fabulous young politicians. For some time, she was the successor candidate for the opposition Democratic Alliance. And then she very quickly fell out because their structures hadn't been democratized or made progressive. And so she felt like she was a talisman in still a very white party, and she quit. And so now she would very much like to run for the mayor of Johannesburg, which would make her the sixth fabulous candidate. It's going to be the race of next year, the race for the city. And like Charles, you said, the gentleman, the property developer who's buying up and turning buildings, the city is about to shift, and with property being quite cheap, you can see people doing that. I spend quite a bit of time in the inner city, and it is changing, notwithstanding the BBC documentary you'd have seen this week. So that is something that I spend my days watching what's happening in Joburg. But I guess my parting shot is I want to book my tickets for that new Egyptian museum. It is simply spectacular. The photographs,
Yeah.
everything about it. I know it's taken forever to build, but I cannot wait to go. And I'm sure that the line there is very long. So that's my parting shot. I hope you travel safely, Bob. Until next week when we'll have a G20 edition. This was an exciting
Mhm.
discussion. More of that next week. Please remember to subscribe, to like, and to share your bad natives. Over and out. Thank you
All
very
right.
much, guys. Travel safely.
All the best, and Bob, our congratulations to the young people.
Fantastic.
I,
They have done
I,
their
I,
aunties
I,
and uncles proud.
yeah, we're still debating, trying to understand the subject of his thesis. So we've decided we don't. We'll just pay the fees and move on. Yeah.
You'll
All right,
understand it
guys.
one day. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Travel safe.
All right. Bye.